So last time we were here, we had created our Lambda function, just going to our second Lambda function, just going to go to it, and what we were able to do was to access our database, go to the chocolate user table, and ask for a particular email address, and it would return the items. If there wasn't one, then it would just return an empty set. And we also needed this little helper function that we used to convert our decimal to an actual decimal number. Now that we have this Lambda function, what we're going to do is make it accessible on the web using an API Gateway. So if we go back to the console and type in API Gateway, we can create our Amazon API Gateway. We're just going to scroll down to REST API and go build. Say OK. We're going to not use an example one, but create our own. And we're going to give it a name, and we're going to call it Get User Profile. You can give it a description if you want. The endpoint, we are going to select edge optimized so that it will actually be as close to the user as possible, the code, and hopefully that will run faster. And we'll say create API. Now, the first thing we have to do is go up to this actions button and say create a resource, because we need to select what we're going to be calling it. And we're going to once again call it user profile, and we're going to enable this, although we're going to have to change something slightly later. Cores will help us out because the API is going to have a different domain than our actual index.html code, and if we're going across domains, for security reason, our browser might not let us do that, so we're going to enable that. And then we say create resource. Now that we have our resource, we go back up to actions and we're going to create a method, and this method is going to connect to our Lambda function. We are going to select a get because we are getting information, and you have to remember to hit this little check mark here. So we're going to select integration with a Lambda function. Make sure you're still using East. It should be the standard region that you've been using for everything, and if you just start typing in here in Lambda function, it will show you your Lambda function that you wrote, get user information, and we're going to say save, and yes, we're going to add the permissions. Okay, so here is the workflow that happens. The request comes from the internet. It integrates the API Gateway with the Lambda function. It runs the Lambda function. It then takes our response and passes it back. One thing we need to do is go up to this integration request. By default, API Gateway will strip out any parameters that are attached to it for security reasons, so we have to do a mapping to enable the user to pass the parameters in, because if you remember, we're actually passing in through events the user email address. So we have to allow that, and we're going to be adding a mapping template. And yes, we're going to select a JSON one, so they give you a little grayed out, and we're just going to type in the exact same thing here, application.json. And once again, that little check mark. And yes, we're going to secure it. So here's a template where you place in the mapping between what is going to be the parameter that's passed in from the internet in a URL to what gets transposed over to being passed in through this event here. So I have a little template and I have a little comment. This email address here is what is being passed to the Lambda function So if you remember, email address is this right here. And this on this side is what the URL parameter will be called. So it's going to pass user email over to email address. Sometimes you'll see these as being the same. I just wanted to make them different so that you could understand what is happening. So we're going to say save. And then we can go back. So now what we can do is we can test this even before we do anything else, just to make sure it works, and we'll be able to pass in this as our parameter and see that it works properly. So we can go to test, and if we don't pass any parameter in at all and we run test, you'll see that we get an error because that's not the way that our API is going to be working. So we are going to say that the email, user email, is equal to, and I'm just going to go back. We need to get a just going to go up here to test and grab the actual email address so that I have it correctly. There we go. Okay, so we're going to pass in the user email of Jane Smith, and hopefully it will return the row just like it did right here. So we're going to go to test again, and there you go. So we know that this does work. It doesn't work great if we put in one that is incorrect. It'll give us the empty one, and even, which is okay. Even worse is if you don't pass any parameters in, but we will fix that later. So once we have this tested and working, there's two things we need to do. First thing, we go up to actions and we have to enable this CORS. Once again, this is to ensure that when we actually deploy this and we use it in our index.html file, that different domains can talk to each other. So we're just going to hit enable and say yes, it will do a bunch of things, and we're good to go. Next thing, this needs to be deployed because it actually isn't available on the internet yet. So we're going to go to deploy. You can set up different stages. Usually you would have a testing and a production. We're just going to create a production stage at the moment, and we're going to hit deploy. Don't worry about the error. This is because we're using a student account. And you'll see up here in the stage, we're in production. There is our method. If we alternate click and open that up in a new tab, it will run. And remember when we did the test and we didn't pass any parameters in and we got an error that looked just like this? This is because we aren't passing any parameters into it. So what we need to do is actually pass the parameters in like we did when we did our test. So if we go back here and we go back to test, you remember that we passed in the parameters here. I'm just going to go to the mat integration and get the actual exact. So it's that as the parameter, and the way parameters work on the web is you put a question mark, you put the parameter, and then you put equals, and then we're going to grab the user's email address again from the test. There it is. And we're going to put that in. Sorry, that did not work. Okay, picking it up. There we go, third time charm. Okay, so this is the parameter that's being passed in, and when we press enter, now we get the return. If we put in an incorrect user. It will just give us, whoop, we had an error there. There we go. It gives us the empty set. And just to make sure that it works, we're going to select, I think I could put mine in here. No, I guess I'm not in there. Anyways, it will give us an empty one. So this is now the URL that is accessible on the internet, and anyone in the world can access this. That's not really great because you don't want it totally open to anyone in the internet, but we will fix that later. Once we have this working, then we can actually write our HTML code to grab this and use it.